Sacsayhuaman. These rocks contain mysteries that challenge our fundamental understanding of the entire history of humankind.
For nearly 500 years now, the megalithic walls above the city of Cusco have looked impossible from the outside. 100-ton stones cut and shaped to fit together without a paper-thin gap. Earthquakes that flatten entire cities pass through them and leave the joints tight. Everyone assumed the strangeness ended where the wall met the ground. It did not.
The history of a site like this is way more ancient, way more mysterious, way more incredible than anything that we today currently understand.
New ground-penetrating radar scans at Sacsayhuaman just returned signatures from beneath the foundations themselves. Geometric shapes, buried alignments, something older than the walls everyone has been photographing for centuries. And whatever is down there is about to rewrite the entire story. The scan that found too much. This was supposed to be a routine survey, the kind of project that adds a footnote to a textbook and gets archived. The research team came to Sacsayhuaman with 3D scanners, ground-penetrating radar, and geological analysis equipment to refine the existing model of how the famous walls were assembled.
We are a Swiss company. I started participating in this project since last year. We brought one of our instruments. Now he's in charge of the archaeologist. He's been sending information, he's been sending data, we trained him, and now we help him with the post-processing of the data.
Refine, not rewrite. The first day's data fit the textbook. The second day did too. By the third pass over the upper terrace, the radar started returning signatures that did not match anything the team had planned for. Foundations below the foundations. Cavities where the bedrock should have been solid. Alignments running in directions that the visible walls above them ignored entirely. Here is what nobody tells you. These signatures were not faint. They were not edge-of-error blips that a skeptical reviewer could wave off. They were strong, repeating, and consistent across multiple passes with multiple instruments. Whatever was down there was substantial enough to bounce radar like a basement wall. The team reviewed the data with the geological analyst that evening in the field office above the ruins. The man's reaction was understated and, in a way, unforgettable. The feeling, he said, the very strong feeling, was that the team was looking at a two-phase construction site, two distinct construction events, two different sets of builders, possibly separated by a stretch of time nobody had yet been able to measure. Two phases, different hands, different eras. That sentence detonates everything. Because if the upper walls and the buried foundations were not made by the same people, then the most famous stonework in the Americas may be sitting on top of something older, something the Inca inherited rather than created. And the question that has haunted these stones for centuries returns louder than before. If the Inca did not build the original layer, then who did? And why has nobody ever been able to find their bones? The geological analysis sharpened the picture even further. The bedrock under Sacsayhuaman shows signs of deliberate shaping that extends meters below the modern ground line. Cuts that match no natural fracture pattern. Surfaces that appear to have been leveled before any wall was raised on top of them. In a few sectors, the radar response indicated dense material arranged in geometric patterns that fall outside any natural geological signature. Whatever produced those signals was put there by someone with intent. None of this is conclusive on its own. Radar data is interpretive. It shows density contrasts, not photographs. A signal that looks like a buried wall might turn out to be compacted fill, or a collapsed cavity, or an ancient drainage channel. Instruments can map the question. Only excavation can answer it. But the pattern of signals is consistent enough across the site that the research team is treating the two-phase reading as the working hypothesis, not a fringe idea to be brushed off. Walls that shouldn't exist. To understand why the new findings matter, you have to understand what the walls already were. And what they already were is impossible. High in the Andes, in a band that stretches from Cusco down through the Sacred Valley and across the border into Bolivia, there are stone constructions that defy every assumption about ancient capability. Sacsayhuaman is the most famous. Its zigzag terraces are built from limestone blocks that in places weigh more than 100 tons. Some of the larger stones push closer to 200 tons. They are stacked without mortar.
Behind me is one of the most interesting stones at the site, one of the largest as well. Estimates put this at like 150 tons. But you can see all the different angles on here that go round really beautifully.
They lean inward at a precise batter angle that resists seismic shock, and they fit. They fit so closely that a sheet of paper cannot be slipped between adjacent blocks. Not in a few places, across entire walls. Now picture this. A short walk away at Ollantaytambo, builders pulled massive pink granite blocks from a quarry on the opposite side of a valley. The stones had to descend one slope, cross a river, and climb the other side to reach the construction terrace. Some of those stones weigh 50 tons, some weigh more. The route is rugged, the elevation gains severe, and there is no archaeological evidence of the kind of large-scale earthworks that moving blocks like that should have left behind. Across the border at Pumapunku in Bolivia, the materials shift to something even harder to explain. The stones there are andesite and diorite, both extraordinarily hard. Some require tools harder than the stone itself to cut cleanly. The fascinating thing about Pumapunku is how these structures got built at all. Pumapunku is so unique in the way that it was constructed and shaped and positioned that it is one of the most intriguing ancient sites on the planet. Yet the blocks at Pumapunku display straight drilled holes, perfectly squared interior corners, and precisely spaced grooves that look like they came off industrial equipment. The surfaces are smooth in a way that hand tools struggle to reproduce on rocks of that hardness. Yeah, about that. None of these sites have a satisfying explanation, individually or collectively. The materials are too heavy, too hard, or too distant. The precision is too high. The fit is too tight. The earthquake survival rate in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth is too good to be accidental. Now the new scans have added a new layer to the problem. Whatever technique produced the visible walls above ground may not have been the same technique that produced what is buried beneath them. So which technique came first, and where did it go? A puzzle of stone. Stand close to a wall at Sacsayhuaman, and the strangeness becomes physical. The stones are not rectangular, they are not standardized, they are polygonal masonry in its most extreme form, irregular and interlocking on multiple faces. A single block can have 8, 10, or 12 sides. Each side is cut to match the contour of the neighboring stone exactly. There is no trimming gap, no chinking, no filler. The faces are flush. The angles are mutual. Each block was carved with the surrounding blocks already in mind, which means the builders either fitted each stone in place through repeated lifting and trial, or they had a method of measuring and shaping that allowed precise pre-cutting. Both options are absurd. Trial-fitting 100-ton blocks would require lifting and lowering massive weights dozens of times until the match was perfect. Pre-cutting requires an accurate three-dimensional record of the receiving stones, which is itself a serious measurement task without modern instruments. Here is the part that gets quiet. Modern stonemasons, when shown the joints up close, often go silent. Carlos Mendoza, a master mason who has worked on heritage restoration in Cusco for over 30 years, told a documentary crew that the work would be challenging even with diamond saws, laser scanners, and hydraulic equipment. He said it in a way that did not sound like a craftsman boasting. It sounded like a craftsman confessing. The standard explanation that the builders used hammerstones of harder rock to shape the limestone over generations accounts for the labor. It does not fully account for the speed at which the empire is said to have expanded its monumental construction, or for the consistency of the result across hundreds of meters of wall. And there is one further detail nobody talks about enough. The stones are not only matched on their visible faces, the blocks extend backward into the wall, and the rear contours of those embedded portions are also shaped to fit their neighbors. The precision runs through the depth of the wall. Whoever cut these blocks shaped the unseen surfaces with the same care as the visible ones. They invested equal labor on faces that no human eye would ever see. Why would anyone do that? Who builds a hidden masterpiece into the backside of a wall? And what were they hiding it from? If you are still with us, hit subscribe right now, because what comes next is the part of the story that explains why these stones may have been moved by methods that have been lost from the archaeological record entirely. The transport problem makes the carving problem look small. The quarry problem before a stone can be carved, it has to arrive. And the arrival is where the story breaks down completely. At Ollantaytambo, the quarry sits across the Urubamba Valley from the building site. The blocks were extracted from a steep slope, lowered down toward the valley floor, brought across the river, and hauled up the opposite ridge. There are partial drag marks at certain points along the route. There are abandoned stones scattered along the path, sometimes referred to as tired stones, which appear to have been left mid-journey for reasons no one has been able to determine. We see multi-ton blocks of rose granite thrown across hillsides as if they were Jenga pieces. We see vitrification of stone that appears glass-like. We see the signs of ancient degradation far beyond the timescale of the Inca. The standing theory involves wooden rollers, hemp ropes, packed earthen ramps, and very large workforces. Experimental archaeology has shown that smaller stones can indeed be moved this way. Reconstructions involving blocks of 1 or 2 tons are well documented. The trouble starts as the weight scales. Friction increases non-linearly. Rollers crush, ropes fail. The manpower required balloons past anything a regional population should have been able to sustain. No full-scale demonstration has ever moved a 50-ton block across the kind of terrain found at Ollantaytambo using only the technology available to the Inca. Now, this is where it gets worse. The puzzle reaches its highest pitch at Puma Punku. The site sits on a high plateau more than 13,000 feet above sea level. The andesite blocks were quarried from a source roughly 10 kilometers away. The diorite came from even farther. There are no rivers nearby capable of floating multi-ton stones. The terrain is exposed, cold, and oxygen poor. Sustained heavy labor at that altitude is brutally hard for modern workers fully acclimated and equipped, let alone for a workforce relying on llamas and reed ropes. The blocks arrived anyway. They were placed. Some of them were locked together with metal clamps cast in I-beam shapes. The molten alloy poured directly into matching grooves carved into adjacent stones. That metallurgical detail alone implies a level of organized production that does not appear anywhere else in the regional archaeological record. So, how did stones that should not have been able to move arrive on a plateau where humans can barely breathe? And if the two-phase reading is correct, did the earlier builders use the same impossible methods, or something we have not even imagined yet? Not our work. Here is something historians have known for centuries and almost never put on the front page. The Inca, when asked, did not claim credit for the oldest stonework. Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century recorded interviews with Inca informants describing the Great Walls. The accounts are not identical, but a pattern keeps showing up. The largest and oldest stones, the informants said, were already in place when the Inca rose to dominance in the region. Officially, this dates to around 1400 AD or thereabouts, which is just a few years before the Spanish arrived. Although the traditions of the Inca say quite differently, that these were built by a race of giants in prehistory. The earliest constructions were attributed to a previous people, sometimes described in mythic terms, sometimes simply as ancestors whose methods had been lost. They did not build it. They said so themselves. Modern archaeology has tended to read these accounts as legend, as the kind of attribution myth that all civilizations attach to monumental structures whose origins they no longer remember. That reading is reasonable on its own. Oral tradition often runs ahead of the evidence and behind it at the same time. Yeah, about that. The new scan data introduces a serious problem for the dismissive reading. If the buried foundations at Sacsayhuaman are demonstrably older than the visible walls, and if the visible walls are demonstrably Inca, then the Inca testimony about inheriting earlier construction is not myth, it is observation. The empire that historians have credited with the entire site may have been the latest occupants of a place that was already monumental when they arrived. There is also a linguistic clue worth flagging. In several Andean languages, the oldest stone constructions carry names that translate roughly as the work of those who came before, or the place that was already here. These phrases are not necessarily mythological. They may be straightforward inherited memory, passed down through enough generations that the original culture's identity faded, but the fact of its presence survived. Inherited memory like this is not unprecedented. Australian Aboriginal oral traditions preserve geographically accurate descriptions of coastlines that drowned more than 7,000 years ago. If similar memory persisted in the Andes, the Inca testimony about earlier builders may sit closer to historical record than to legend. So, if the Inca were telling the truth, who exactly did they inherit a fortress from? And why did that earlier civilization vanish from the record so cleanly that not even a name survived? The stone knobs. Across Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, and several smaller sites, certain blocks display features that nobody has been able to interpret with confidence. The most discussed are the stone knobs. These knobs, or nodules, are really interesting because conventional archaeologists say that they were used to tie ropes around in order to put the stones into place. Look at them closely. These are small protrusions deliberately left on the outer faces of finished stones. They appear in patterns, sometimes aligned, sometimes scattered. Standard interpretations include rope anchors for moving the block during construction, ceremonial markers, structural keys for adjacent unbuilt walls, and astronomical or acoustic indicators. None of these interpretations fully explains why the knobs were left in place after construction was complete, why they appear on stones that would have been visible from a distance, and why their distribution does not align cleanly with practical transport needs. There are other oddities. Some blocks show signs of having been cut, then recut. Others bear faint scoop marks that resemble impressions left by softening rather than chipping, as though the surface had been worked when the stone was in a different physical state. A handful of researchers have proposed plant-based stone softening agents, an idea drawn from local folklore about a bird that uses leaves to dissolve rock. The chemistry has never been demonstrated in a controlled test. The idea remains speculative, but the marks themselves are real, and conventional carving has trouble accounting for some of them. Now, watch this. The high-resolution scans add to this catalog. Below the visible surface, the radar returns shapes that do not correspond to any documented Inca foundation style. Some of the buried alignments are precisely cardinal. Others suggest internal voids or possible chambers that have not yet been excavated. Until shovels go in the ground, these readings will remain readings rather than confirmations. But the data is there on file, logged, time-stamped, waiting, and it is not going away. Researchers have also flagged a small number of stones at Sacsayhuaman that show machining marks inconsistent with the chipping patterns expected from hammerstones. Faint, parallel grooves, evenly spaced, run across certain interior surfaces in patterns that resemble the trace of a rotating tool rather than a striking one. It looks almost like some kind of tool was driven across them, although there are no spirals anywhere, no spirals or steps like the ones seen on the pieces over at the museum in the other village. Conservative interpretations attribute them to later damage or natural weathering. The newer high-resolution scans, which capture surface detail at sub-millimeter precision, may finally allow a definitive analysis. If the marks are original construction features, the toolkit attributed to the builders will have to expand. If they are modern damage, one of the longer-running controversies about the site quietly resolves. So, what produced those? Grooves? And why are they hiding on surfaces that no tour guide ever points out? Built to survive quakes. There is one experiment these walls keep passing that nobody designed them to take. The Andes are seismically violent. Cusco itself has suffered repeated major earthquakes, and in places where the wall has been pulled apart by earthquakes, you can see that the joints are not straight lines. They are actually curves, compound complex curvature. Several quakes were severe enough to flatten Spanish colonial structures built directly on top of Inca foundations. The colonial buildings collapsed. The Inca foundations did not. In some cases, the stones shifted slightly during a quake, rocked through the seismic wave, and resettled into their original positions with the joints still tight. The polygonal interlock acts as a passive damping system. The slight inward batter angle redirects seismic energy back into the wall rather than allowing it to throw the structure apart. This is not accident. This is design. Yeah, about that. Engineers who have studied the geometry note additional features that read as deliberate seismic engineering. The corners of the Great Walls are rounded rather than squared, which prevents stress concentration at the most vulnerable points of any rigid structure. The largest blocks are placed at the base, with progressively smaller blocks above. lowering the center of mass. The internal interlock pattern means that no single failure point can propagate. If one stone shifts, it returns to its seat because the surrounding stones constrain its motion in every direction except the one it traveled. Modern base isolation systems for skyscrapers use the same principle of allowing controlled movement and self-recentering. Ancient builders arrived at the same solution in stone on a mountain plateau without engineering literature to reference. Earthquake survival is one of the strongest arguments against the idea that these structures were assembled by trial and error. A trial and error wall fails on the first major quake. These walls have absorbed quakes for centuries and remain standing. So if the builders understood seismic loading on a level modern engineering did not formalize until the 20th century, where did they learn it? And what other knowledge died with them? 2 phases. 2 builders. Scientific interpretation of ancient sites usually moves in small steps. Most surveys confirm what was already suspected. Most papers refine a date or clarify a method. The Sacsayhuaman results are unusual because they push in a direction the standard timeline did not anticipate. If the site has 2 construction phases, the questions branch fast. When was the earlier phase? What culture preceded the Inca in this exact location? Why did the later builders choose to build directly on top of the older foundation rather than alongside it or elsewhere? Did the Inca know what they were standing on? Did they consider the lower courses sacred, useful, or simply convenient? Now, consider this. There are precedents for layered sites elsewhere in the world. Göbekli Tepe revealed that monumental architecture predates settled agriculture by thousands of years. It was built 11,500 years ago by hunter-gatherers. That is 6,000 years earlier than Stonehenge. Underwater surveys off the coasts of India and Japan have suggested submerged structures from periods when sea levels were significantly lower. The Sacsayhuaman findings do not require comparable revisions to global prehistory. They require, at minimum, a rethink of South American chronology and the relationship between the Inca and whoever came before them. A 2-phase reading also forces a re-examination of how the visible Inca walls relate to the buried foundations physically. The radar suggests that the upper courses sit directly on the older work in some sectors, with no clear separation layer. The Inca builders cleared the foundation surfaces, assessed their stability, and used them as the platform for their own additions. They did not bury the older work, they built on it. That is the behavior of a culture that recognized quality construction when it found it and chose to extend rather than erase. In other parts of the site, the radar shows the buried structures running at angles that diverge from the visible walls above. The Inca additions follow their own orientation, ignoring the older alignment. Either the earlier site had a broader footprint than the Inca, chose to reuse, or the original builders organized the space according to a logic the later occupants did not preserve. So how much of Sacsayhuaman is even Inca? And how much of what tourists photograph every day was never theirs to begin with? The open questions. The honest summary is that the megalithic walls of Peru and Bolivia remain unsolved. Most of the questions have not moved in decades. The transport of the stones has not been demonstrated at full scale. The carving of the joints has not been replicated using only the tools the builders are believed to have possessed. The cultural identity of the earliest builders, if they were a separate group from the later Inca, has not been established. The purpose of the stone knobs is undecided. The buried structures detected in the scans have not been excavated. What changed is the shape of the mystery. The question used to be how the Inca did it. Now the question is whether the Inca did all of it or whether they finished a project someone else started. So who started it, and what happens when the first shovel finally hits the layer underneath? The walls still speak. The instruments that found the buried structures at Sacsayhuaman did not invent new walls. The walls have always been there. The stones have always carried whatever record they carry. What changed is that the technology finally caught up far enough to read a deeper layer of the file. Yeah, about that. This is the pattern that has held in archaeology for a long time. Sites that seemed fully understood reveal additional dimensions when new instruments arrive. LIDAR peeled back the jungle canopy of the Maya world. It turns out that even in the thickest jungle, if you lie on the ground and look up, you will always see little bits of blue sky here and there, and those billions and billions of laser beams find every little hole in the jungle canopy, exposing entire urban networks that ground surveys had missed. Multispectral imaging recovered erased text from medieval manuscripts. Ground-penetrating radar has now begun, slowly, to do for stone monuments what LIDAR did for forests. The implication is that the megalithic walls of Peru are not done speaking. There are likely more chambers, more alignments, and possibly more phases waiting beneath sites that have been mapped 100 times from above. The next decade of work in the Andes, if funding and access hold, will look very different from the last decade. The questions asked of the stones will be sharper. The instruments turned on them will be finer. Now, here is the strange part. Stone itself is notoriously hard to date directly. Radiocarbon requires organic material, which is scarce in a quarried wall, but optically stimulated luminescence can sometimes date the moment a buried surface was last exposed to sunlight, which would help establish when foundation layers were placed. New techniques in cosmogenic isotope dating may eventually allow researchers to estimate when a stone surface was carved by measuring the accumulation of certain isotopes that build up only in exposed rock. The toolkit available to archaeologists working in the Andes is broader now than it has ever been, and the megalithic sites are obvious candidates for the next generation of analysis. Until that work is done, the walls keep their secret. They sit where they have always sat, fitting together stone by stone in a pattern that should not be possible with the tools the textbooks allow. They have outlasted the Inca, who might or might not have built them, the Spanish who tried to build over them, the colonial governments that ignored them, the modern roads that cut around them, the centuries of earthquakes that should have leveled them. They are still standing. They are still aligned. And now there is something underneath them that nobody expected to find. So, when the first excavation team finally cuts into that buried layer, what will they pull out of the dirt? And how much of human history is going to have to be rewritten the moment they do? If you have made it this far, you already know this is the kind of investigation that does not get covered honestly by the algorithm-chasing channels. Hit like, drop a comment with which megalithic site you want covered next, and subscribe so the follow-up on the buried chambers at Sacsayhuaman lands in your feed the moment the dig permits go through. The next chapter of this story is being written in real time, and you are going to want to be here when it breaks.